I'm Matt Guichard, and this is No Holds Barred. In today's episode, we're going to talk about police pursuits and the potential liability. Let's talk about police pursuits. You know, we see and we hear about it all the time. Go on YouTube, you see these episodes of police pursuits, mostly down in Southern California, that go on and on forever. And people often ask, what the heck is going on here? Who is liable? And we're not talking about the liability of the person in the car that's fleeing from an officer. We don't know why they're being stopped. The liability we're concerned about is there a liability on the part of the police agency? And what if that fleeing car runs into some innocent people and kills or injures them? Who's liable for that? Well, it's an interesting question that I'm often asked. And I do want to say most police agencies have what's called a pursuit policy. But let's go back even farther. In the Penal Code, the California Penal Code, there is a section which specifically deals with police pursuits and authorizing police pursuits and designating the training that officers should go through before they engage in police pursuits. I do want to say, and I'm going to cite it for you, California Penal Code section 13519.8, and it establishes the guidelines for agencies and police pursuit. And then I want to talk about the California Vehicle Code section 17004.7, and that discusses the immunity that the police have, a term called qualified immunity. People let their hair catch on fire when they hear about qualified immunity as it relates to police shootings, perhaps, or various things. Qualified immunity only applies in civil actions against a police agency. The police have qualified immunity in these kinds of pursuits. Let's talk about some examples. What an example? In Contra Costa County, a couple of years ago, there was a stolen car that a police officer observed and followed behind it on the freeway. It was not a pursuit in the sense the officer didn't turn on his lights or siren. He just drove at normal speed, and so did the stolen car, traveled at normal speed. It was obvious to the officer that the driver of the stolen car knew he was behind him, but he wasn't attempting to stop him. So that person drove off the freeway down to the bottom of the freeway ramp, and there was a signal there, and it was red for that vehicle. Ran through the red light, struck a vehicle, and killed two of the occupants of the vehicle. Totally innocent people that were traveling on a red light. So you say to yourself, goodness, who is responsible for that? And the first question is, was it a police pursuit? Was the police officer chasing him, or was he simply observing him? As the officer said, I was simply observing him, waiting for some backup, and we would determine whether or not we were going to stop this vehicle. So the whole question comes down to, was that a pursuit? Well, actually, it was a pursuit in the sense that the officer was behind him. But is the officer responsible for, or is the police agency? They had a regular pursuit policy. In that policy, what typically happens is an officer describes to a supervisor, usually a sergeant, I'm in pursuit, the vehicle is failing to yield, asking the traffic is clear, the weather is clear, and the reason for the stop. Now, oftentimes, the officer will know that it's a murder suspect, or it's a suspect just fleeing from an armed robbery at a bank, something such as that, and generally they're going to pursue. And they get permission if traffic is so bad under the pursuit policy, the supervisor will, in many cases, call it off. So the pursuit was actually initiated, lights and siren, and then they call it off, and the officer shuts down. The vehicle takes off, and oftentimes we hear about a mile up the road, the vehicle is still doing a great deal of speed and runs into a tree and kills the driver, or runs into somebody else and kills them. Well, is that a pursuit? And the police will say, look, under our policy, we did everything we were supposed to do. We pursued for a short period of time. Under our policy, we determined that it was a danger to the public, and we shut it down. In many cases, a helicopter or a plane is brought in overhead, and they can shut down a pursuit even when it might be no traffic or issues, but sometimes the speed is so great that the police will actually shut down those pursuits. Now, that's not what we see on those videos on YouTube coming out of the LA area. Those are videos of pursuits, long pursuits, and incredibly dangerous pursuits over a period of time. I look at those things oftentimes with interest, and I understand so many of our agencies up here have no pursuit policies. For example, Piedmont Police Department has a no pursuit policy. And what does that mean? It means an officer sees somebody commit an infraction or knows that they are wanted. They have cameras in Piedmont so that when people come into town, there's an automatic notification of a stolen vehicle. The officers go to that area, perhaps see the vehicle. If they attempt to stop it and the vehicle stops, good to go. If the vehicle flees out of their jurisdiction, they have a no pursuit policy. They cannot pursue. So it's interesting, the other day I was driving in our jurisdiction. I was driving in Concord, and there's a split, two highways. 680 goes in one direction, 242 in another, and out of the corner of my eye, a car went probably doing over 100 miles an hour and passed me on the left and cut across all the traffic over to 242, almost running into the sound wall. And I was flabbergasted. Shortly behind it was a California Highway Patrol officer shot by the same kind of a thing. I turned and went on 242 just to kind of see of interest. And slightly up the road, there was the highway patrolman on the side of the road. His lights were still on, but he was parked on the side of the road, and the fleeing vehicle was not stopped. So it was obvious that that officer made the decision, or perhaps his supervisor, that there was so much traffic, and it was during the commute hour, there was so much traffic that it was a danger. Now, they get the license plates, numbers of those vehicles, oftentimes find them down the road. The problem is oftentimes they're stolen vehicles, and many times people get away. The problem with all that is, of course, people see that on television. They know it. They know that if I go fast enough and far enough, an agency may not chase me, and I may get away. And that has unfortunately caused these dangerous pursuits to multiply in spite of these agencies' positions as to a no pursuit. Let's get back to saying, is an agency responsible for injury or death to, let's say, an innocent party? So that one that I talked about, let's assume that it was a pursuit, that the law actually said, well, you were behind it, and we're going to characterize it as a pursuit. That agency has immunity from that. Everything that they did fell within their pursuit policy and within the law. So very seldom do we actually see an agency that is found liable for a pursuit. Now, it has to be obviously incredibly dangerous. Let's assume an officer called off a pursuit or was called off and continued to pursue outside of the policy. What would happen in that particular case if an innocent person was injured? Well, for the most part, there is still the immunity that the agency has for that particular event. And people are often quite concerned about that, but that is true. I recall listening to, I don't think it was a podcast, but a show by another lawyer that was talking about police pursuits and describing how if a police officer was pursuing somebody, say, into kind of a crowded farmer's market area, then the officer would be liable. And I say, well, actually, no, that agency still has that immunity. They would have to commit some kind of incredible gross negligence outside their policies and outside this penal code section that I've talked to and the vehicle code section that also I've mentioned. So in most cases, an agency will not be responsible, in spite of what we hear from some lawyers who want to kind of wax eloquent about, come to me because we'll help you when there's a police pursuit. I do like to talk about cases about reasons for a pursuit, as I mentioned before, the weather, the traffic, the air cover, all of those things are actually in that penal code section that I cited to you. When I look at pursuits, I often say, what is the reason? Now, I handled a case some years ago as a coroner's inquest officer involving a local agency. Somebody was known to have committed a couple of murders in West Contra Costa County. The police triangulated his cell phone, and actually it was determined that his vehicle, at least, was in another jurisdiction. It was called out. Officers from that jurisdiction responded to the location of the vehicle. It was parked in a apartment complex parking lot. As the officers got out of their cars and started to approach, the taillights on the vehicle lit up. The vehicle backed out and took off. One of the officers fired a shotgun at the vehicle into the rear tire, totally destroying the rear tire of that vehicle. And that vehicle fled from that jurisdiction onto the freeway, all the way down into another county, all the way back around, up Highway 80, onto 580, and into another jurisdiction. And there were a half a dozen police cars in pursuit. What was the reason for that? It was a murder suspect. In the vehicle with him was his girlfriend. During the pursuit, he killed his girlfriend while in the vehicle. And ultimately, the vehicle stopped in still another jurisdiction. The driver of the vehicle got out, ran into a store, brandished a knife at the officers. At this point, it was the Highway Patrol, and he was shot and killed. So I only tell that story because how could a pursuit like that last? His tire was destroyed. Pieces of his car were flying off, actually damaged some of the vehicles that were in pursuit. They called off the initial agency. The Highway Patrol in one jurisdiction got involved. They called them off when they were in another Highway Patrol jurisdiction, and they took over. They moved into another Highway Patrol jurisdiction. They took over. They called off the others. And finally, they ended up in the final jurisdiction. So I say that because I just want to say how incredibly dangerous police pursuits can be. And the police are very careful in most instances to pursue when it's safe, pursue when they appreciate that it's somebody very dangerous in the vehicle. Now, if it's just somebody with a registration that is expired, they have no other reason. It could be a murder, but they don't know it. Oftentimes, they will call that out and hope that somebody overhead will see that vehicle, spot it, meaning in a police helicopter or something like that. I've had several cases where police pursuits and the people within the vehicle who are fleeing have not run into anyone, but they themselves have run into perhaps a tree or something like that and killed themselves. And in many cases, the families in those people are quite upset that the police chased their loved one. But the fact of the matter is, there is no liability whatsoever by the police in that kind of situation. Now, I don't want to say to any of you who are listening to this or watching it today that it's appropriate to flee from the police because you may get away and they may call it off. That's not appropriate. If you are pulled over by a police officer, do everything that we've talked about before. pull to the right, turn off your vehicle, turn off the motor, put your hands on the wheel, and wait to find out the reason for the stop. I can't tell you the number of cases that I've seen in coroner's inquest where there is a pursuit. Somebody dies, typically the driver crashing the vehicle, and he had an expired license, or maybe had a couple of extra tickets or something. No reason in the world why that person should have died, and no reason in the world why he shouldn't have just pulled over for safety purposes. But people do things, and we don't know why always that these happen, but they often happen, and it's most unfortunate. If you enjoyed this episode of No Holds Barred, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. And absolutely put your questions below. I read them, and I look forward to answering those questions in future No Holds Barred episodes.